Hey guys, tonight we're peeling back the myth and stepping into the very real, very grim world of medieval assassins. The figures who snuck through castle corridors, ducked into shadows, and altered the fate of kingdoms not with armies or speeches, but with a blade and a moment of silence. Now, we love a good mysterious assassin in a video game or movie. Hooded, agile, draped in leather, climbing towers to inspiring orchestral soundtracks. But let's just say, if you were actually a medieval assassin, your life would suck. Bad pay, no perks, constant risk of gruesome death. So before you settle in, take a second to like the video and subscribe if, and only if, you genuinely enjoy this kind of storytelling. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing how many night owls we've got around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe put on a little background hum, and let's get into it. Let's start with this. Nobody in the Middle Ages grew up dreaming of being an assassin. There wasn't a how to become a shadowy murderer handbook passed out at peasant school. It wasn't a job. It was a dead end. Literally, becoming an assassin was the career equivalent of your life falling off a cliff and you deciding, may as well jump. These people weren't trained in ancient temples or climbing up monastery walls in slow motion montages. They were broke, desperate, and invisible to the rest of society. Failed soldiers, outlaws, or just people who were too good at disappearing. You didn't become an assassin because you had skills. You became one because nobody would notice if you went missing or if your target did. If you were lucky enough to own a goat, congratulations, you were management. You hired assassins. If you were sleeping in an alley behind a tavern, missing 2 teeth, and had a talent for silence, that's when someone might slide a little coin purse across the table and whisper a name. And that name was never Bob the turnip farmer. It was a noble, a bishop, someone with guards, walls, and probably a paranoid streak a mile wide. Taking the job wasn't glorious. It was horrifying. But if you'd already lost your family, your home, your future, and your dignity, what else was there? And let's be clear, there were no perks. No days off. No support group. You couldn't exactly advertise your services with a sign that read discreet eliminations. 10% off for clergy. You had to pretend to be something else. A traveling peddler. A carpet merchant. Oh, this bloodstain. Spilled wine. Yeah, very red wine. Assassins weren't heroes. They weren't even villains. They were ghosts with trust issues and knives. Let's bust the next myth. Training. There wasn't any. No mountain dojos. No candlelit halls with masters in flowing robes. If you learned anything, it was because your last mistake didn't kill you. Weapons training. You had a dagger, not a ceremonial, dragon-engraved masterpiece. A rusty chunk of iron you took off a dead guard. Maybe a garrote made from an old bootlace. If you had a bow, you'd better know how to hide it inside a basket of laundry, or pretend it was part of your traveling loot collection. Poison. Oh yeah. Medieval poison was a real thing. And it was terrible. You were basically guessing which mushroom or crushed rock would make a noble keel over, and which one would just give them gas. Sometimes you poisoned the wrong goblet. Sometimes you drank the wrong goblet. There was no poison control hotline. Just you, some herbs, and the terrifying hope that this powder didn't just smell like feet for no reason. There were no manuals, no cheat sheets, no mentors. If you were lucky, you met another assassin who showed you how not to squeak on cobblestones. But even that came with a price. Assassins didn't retire. They vanished. Or ended up at the bottom of a well. So where did your skills come from? Survival. You learned to move fast, stay quiet, and kill quickly. No flourishes. No drama. Just one stab and gone. Because every second after the kill, that was a countdown to your potential death. Now let's talk about why you even said yes to this job. Easy. Money, or at least the idea of money. You'd get approached with a proposition. Half now, half when the job's done. Sounds good, right? But when the job's done really meant if you succeed, if you don't get caught, if you don't leave a trail, if you don't survive long enough to cause problems. That second half usually didn't come. You'd return to collect, only to hear, sorry, the client fled the city. Guess you'll have to find him. Or worse, the client doesn't flee. They try to kill you, because a knife to your gut costs less than a bonus. And even when you did get paid, it was never enough. Not for the days you spent hiding in a barrel next to a dead rat. or the 3-week rash you got from crouching in a haystack. You'd get 10 silver coins and a vague threat to never speak of this again. Some jobs, total scams, political setups. You'd be told to kill a dangerous noble, show up, and boom guards waiting. Congratulations, you just walked into a trap. Hope you enjoyed being the bait. And no, you couldn't exactly sue for breach of contract. Your Honor, I'd like to report unpaid wages for one attempted murder. So eventually, you learn the rules. Take cash up front, trust no one, and treat every smiling face like it might have a crossbow behind it. Even the guy paying you might have someone else following you just to make sure you never talked. Now let's get into the tools. Forget anything you've seen in movies. No wrist blades, no grappling hooks, no throwing stars made of Damascus steel. Your equipment was whatever you could steal, sharpen, and hide. A good dagger. That was gold, literally and figuratively. It didn't need to be fancy. Just sharp, preferably not covered in rust or bits from your last job. Poison. That was for those brave or dumb enough to try alchemy with garden weeds. Most of the time it gave your target the runs. Occasionally, it worked. Rarely, it killed. Sometimes you died. Ropes could be useful for strangling or climbing. Sure, but only if you remembered the knot in the heat of the moment. Otherwise, it turned into medieval interpretive dance with someone trying to stab you. Bows were great, until you tried to smuggle one through a palace gate disguised as a chimney sweep. Most kills were up close, fast, silent, brutal, no elegance. Just get it done and vanish. And when your tools failed, you improvised. Roof tile, chair leg, shoe buckle if you were feeling wild. Sure, anything to survive. You didn't polish your gear. You clung to it. It was your only friend, your livelihood, and your retirement plan all rolled into one very sharp bundle. There were no backups. No armorers, just you and the terrifying hope that your blade didn't snap mid-job. So, you've taken the job. The pay is sketchy. The risk is absurd. And your gear is a collection of scavenged nightmares. But now comes the real test. Getting close. Assassins didn't go around knocking on castle doors. Your target was never lounging in an open courtyard with a sign that said, "Stab me here." No, they were important, which meant they were protected. Nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes even royalty. And you were a guy with a fake name and a cloak that smelled like mildew. First obstacle, the guards. Not one or two dozens, armed, armored, and all very bored. Which meant they were alert. Some guarded doors, some patrolled halls, some just stood around looking menacing. You'd spend days memorizing their routines, counting how long it took the one with the bad leg to limp down the stairs. Then there were the walls. This wasn't just a house, it was a fortress. Castles had moats, drawbridges, murder holes, and arrow slits. You didn't sneak through the front gate. You climbed, crawled, bribed, or waited for hours in some godforsaken barrel, hoping the cook didn't decide to dump stew on your head. And don't forget the staff. Cooks, scribes, stable boys, they were everywhere. And medieval gossip traveled at warp speed. One wrong look, one unfamiliar face. And suddenly everyone in the castle knew Brother Tobias looked an awful lot like someone with a very stabby vibe. And the target, always paranoid. Rightfully so. These people didn't trust their food, their family, or their reflection. They had food tasters, decoy beds, hidden exits, and guards who slept standing up. Some even rotated rooms like a royal game of hide and seek with murder on the line. Even if they went to a feast, you couldn't relax. Sure, they'd be drunk, but so would you. And between the royal guard, 3 dogs, a court jester with boundary issues, and 50 nobles all watching each other for signs of treason. The odds of you pulling off a clean kill were, let's call it optimistic. And let's talk disguises. Forget sleek black robes. You didn't look like a ninja. You looked like a guy trying very hard not to be noticed. Your disguise was whatever you could steal off a clothesline peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or the blood-stained remains of a guard uniform that still smelled like regret. Blending in meant looking like you hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limped from an old injury, and couldn't make eye contact. The goal was to be forgettable, but forgettable only bought you 5 minutes, just long enough to do the job or die trying. And masks. Good luck. There were no stylish face coverings. Anything covering your face made you look like a leper, which helped avoid conversation. Sure, but also made it very hard to get past the door at a noble's feast. If someone asked who you were, you had to improvise. I'm Brother Tobias, assigned to roof repairs and silent reflection. Please ignore the blood. Even if your disguise worked, you had to stay in character for hours, carrying chamber pots, avoiding eye contact, nodding at the right people. One mistake, one confused glance, and it was, hey, I've never seen you before, whack. Candlestick to the skull, game over. Wigs, not a thing. If you needed to look older, you smeared dirt on your face and hoped squinting made you look wise. You didn't transform, you hoped no one looked too closely, and you never had backup. No crossbow-wielding best friend watching from a tower. No potion-brewing alchemist in your corner. No handler giving you coded messages. You had a knife, and zero room for error. Guilds. If they existed, they weren't sending newsletters. Maybe there were whispers of a brotherhood of assassins. But if you met one, they probably didn't want to exchange tips. They wanted you gone. You were a competition, or worse, a liability, even among criminals. You were the weirdo. Thieves and smugglers had friends. You were the guy who made people disappear. No one wanted to sit next to that guy. No one wanted to split stew with a walking execution. And love. Don't even think about it. You couldn't have a partner. You couldn't explain why you came home at 3 a.m. covered in someone else's blood, or why you flinched every time a knock sounded at the door. You couldn't sleep deeply. You couldn't let your guard down. You couldn't let anyone in. You became a shadow. You didn't stay in one place long. You didn't drink too much. You always faced the door. You never used your real name. And even when someone paid you, they probably still didn't know who you were. And what happens if you fail? You freeze at the wrong time. Your target turns unexpectedly. They're with their child. You get a tremor in your hand, or your blade snags on your cloak. Whatever the reason you miss, congratulations. You're now dead, because failure wasn't just a bad review. It was death, usually public, often slow, and always memorable. If you were lucky, they hanged you. If not, welcome to the wheel, the rack, or something charmingly medieval like the Iron Persuader. And even if you escaped the guards, guess what? Now you've got a client who sees you as a loose end. The same person who begged you to kill someone last week now sees you as a threat. You know, too much. And that means there's a second assassin already on the way, one with better luck. And let's not forget the worst part. Shame. You failed. You weren't clean. You weren't perfect. You didn't disappear into the night. You became seen. And for someone in your profession, that was the greatest sin. You could have completed 12 successful contracts. Nobody cared. You were only as good as your last job. And if your last job left the target alive, congratulations again. You're now a walking liability with a price on your head, and maybe a crude sketch of your face nailed to every indoor in town. But let's say you did it. Let's say you pulled it off. You made it into the castle. You found the room. The guard snored at the right time, and your blade did its job. One clean drop. No scream. Just silence. Congratulations. Now run, because being a successful assassin didn't mean sipping wine on a rooftop while fireworks lit the sky. It meant fleeing through alleys in boots soaked with blood and fear, while guards screamed behind you and every door slammed shut. You had to plan the escape before the kill. Disguises, hideouts, fallback routes, a fisherman who owed you a sewer grate loose enough to pry open, a hay cart leaving town at sunrise. Because within minutes, the city would lock down, the gates would close, checkpoints would appear, and a dozen angry, well-fed guards would be reading a vague description that sounded suspiciously like your face. And your client, they'd be gone. No tavern meetup, no thank you card. They'd be dust. Because you, successful assassin, were now the most dangerous person alive. You'd proven you could get into impossible places and do the unthinkable, which meant you had a target on your back the size of a cathedral. And your prize, a pouch of coins, a fake name, and a long road to a new town where no one knew what you'd done. Because success wasn't freedom. It was just the beginning of the next escape. So let's recap. You took the job, you pulled it off, you ran for your life. And now, you're hiding in a barn that smells like damp hay and goat pee, trying to sleep with one eye open and a dagger clutched under your shirt. But here's the final gut punch. Even if you did everything right, even if you got paid, escaped, changed your name, and put 100 miles between you and your past, you were still marked. Because being a medieval assassin wasn't just dangerous, it was cursed. See, the average villager didn't think you were just a sneaky guy with a blade. No, they thought you were something worse. A servant of darkness, a shapeshifter, a leper who made pacts with demons. Superstition was everywhere, and you were walking proof that nightmares walked among men. Some said assassins could vanish into thin air. Others claimed you could speak with spirits, poison someone just by looking at them, or whisper death through walls. To be feared was one thing, but to be mythologized as evil, that got you hunted in a whole different way. You weren't just a murderer. You were a monster. You'd walk into a village, and suddenly everyone's avoiding your gaze, crossing themselves, clutching their children. If anything remotely weird happened, someone got sick, a goat went missing. The well-tasted funny someone would whisper, maybe it was the Shadow Man. And now you've got a mob. And mobs don't need proof. Just a torch, a rumor, and an excuse to scream burn him. Even your tools looked cursed. Carrying a dagger, obviously forged in the fires of hell. Poison, that's not herbs and science, that's witchcraft. And you probably stirred it under a blood moon with a severed finger. Even if you never said a word, your silence alone was enough to make people nervous. And nervous people do stupid things. So, you kept moving. You had to. Staying too long in any one place meant someone would eventually recognize the quiet guy with haunted eyes and call the local priest. And heaven help you if they found your stash of weird herbs, foreign coins, or maps scribbled with your escape routes. Sometimes, you didn't even need to be seen doing anything. You just had to exist. People don't need much when they're scared. A cloak, a limp, an accent, a scar that was enough. In a world where magic and monsters were as real as rainstorms, you didn't need to be guilty, you just needed to be different. Now, let's talk about poison. Because if blades were the messy solution, poison was the elegant one. In theory, in practice, it was a nightmare. You didn't have access to clean, labeled vials of liquid death. You had mushrooms, roots, minerals, crushed bugs, maybe a dead toad if you were lucky. You had to gather a test, mix and hope the result didn't kill you instead. No measurements, no consistency, just vibes and hope, one pinch too little. And the noble spends the night throwing up and upgrades his security, one pinch too much. And you're the one foaming at the mouth before dessert, even if you got the dose right. You had to get it into the food, and medieval kitchens were chaos, fires, shouting, servants everywhere. You'd have to bribe a cook, sneak in posing as a baker, or somehow slip the poison past 3 tasters, a watchdog. And a paranoid noble who hadn't eaten untested stew in 20 years, and say it worked. Say your mark took the bait. Now what? You wait. Could be minutes, could be days. Some poisons made people dizzy, others made them vomit blood. Some made them scream until their last breath. And if they survived, you'd better be long gone. Because guess who gets blamed? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the one guy who asked weird questions about spices last week. And if you were caught, you weren't hanged, you were interrogated, painfully, creatively, until you confessed to poisoning not just your target, but half the kingdom. Then they killed you. Just to be sure, and let's say just for fun, you were successful again. You managed to poison a tyrant, a bishop, a rival noble. You changed the course of history. Surely that earns you a statue. Right, wrong. You don't get remembered, you get erased. Your name was never meant to be known. Your client didn't want a legend. They wanted a result. A dead enemy, not a famous killer. If anyone did know your name, they'd bury it, and if they couldn't, they'd bury you. You weren't a hero. You weren't even a footnote. You were a whisper, a rumor. Some say it was a shadow in the night. That's all you got. If you were lucky, you vanished with a pouch of coin and a fake name. If you weren't, you ended up headless on a pike, labeled a traitor, a heretic, or just that guy who screwed up. Even success didn't protect you. Your own client might send someone after you just to clean up the mess. Why? Because you knew things. You knew who ordered the kill, when it happened, how much they paid. And that kind of knowledge, it made you dangerous. So you couldn't settle down. You couldn't relax. Even if you wanted to retire, no one would let you. You were a risk. Even if you never picked up a dagger again, you were still the man who once did. And that was enough to get you killed. You moved to a quiet village, changed your name to Brother Lucian, sold herbs, pretended your limp came from falling off a horse. You didn't laugh loudly. You didn't drink. You didn't dream. You sat by the fire and waited for someone to knock on the door with a sword behind their back. You couldn't even trust yourself. Years of killing left scars you couldn't see. You flinched at sounds. You never let anyone stand behind you. You stopped sleeping through the night. You avoided mirrors because sometimes you weren't sure you were even still a person. You were a shadow pretending to be one. And eventually, one day, you vanished. No record. No gravity, just dust. Maybe you died in a ditch. Maybe you made it to old age, muttering to yourself about locked doors and poison herbs. Either way, no one noticed. And maybe that's the best ending you could have hoped for. Because now you see the truth. Being a medieval assassin wasn't cool. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even profitable. It was misery. It was mud, fear, stubborn hunger, betrayal. It was being a knife in the dark, with no one to mourn you. A story no one would tell. A life lived in silence and ended in shadows. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing left at the end was the silence. A silence no one would question because no one ever remembered you were there to begin with.